Hey y'all, so for this video I will be talking about antibiotics, and in this session we will be covering the following. So I'll go over some specific definitions and then sensitivity determinations that include minimum inhibitory concentration and minimum bactericidal concentration. And then the Curry-Bauer diffusion test, we'll talk about resistance, efflux pumps, attack points of antimicrobials, and inhibition of cell wall synthesis and processes on the ribosome. Also, before I jump in, I just want to say that for the topics for fungi and for the microbial ecology stuff, as well as the bacterial taxonomy identification, those are, if you're given the PowerPoints or whenever you're studying your notes from the PowerPoints, just keep in mind that a lot of that is just rote memorization, where you just have to keep practicing it over and over again. I recommend making study sheets or making charts, specifically T-charts for the fungi PowerPoint, because a lot of it is classification, and for instance, like an Ascomycete versus a Basidiomycete and the characteristics under that, along with examples. And then with microbial ecology, you're going to be getting into the cycles, like nitrogen cycle, carbon cycle, oxygen cycle. So with that, if you draw it out, that helps. And then with bacterial taxonomy, a lot of that is classification. There's not really a lot that I can contribute to that. It's just knowing it, and that's just really like learning it from PowerPoint. I don't really have a lot to add on to that. But the thing is, with antibiotics, I need to kind of talk y'all through some of this just so that you can see where things overlap. It's a little bit easier just to see those characteristics from the fungi or microbial ecology stuff, but for antibiotics it can be a bit tricky, and people kind of freak out whenever it comes to antibiotics just because of the handout, and this is the antibiotics handout, the infamous antibiotic handout. I know it looks like a lot. It is 2 pages or 2.5, but this is kind of the key to some of the abbreviations up here. As you're studying this, like I said in my previous video for biotechnology, this is exam 3 material, and it's just one of those things like you know it or you don't, and the way you know the material is by practicing it. This is one of those things that you're going to have to read every day or study every day. And I had one student one year just that deleted all these in the cells and just blew up, like enlarged these cells. I think she put it on landscape mode, I think is what she did. And she laminated, like she printed it front and back, and she laminated the sheets, and so she had like an expo marker, and she'd write in all of this to practice. That way she brought it with her. I don't really know any students who've done flashcards for antibiotics. So if you're a big flashcard person, you can do that. That'll probably work. I was never really big on flashcards. I'm one of those that just had to write and rewrite it on the whiteboard. And then I tried to learn 2 a day. The penicillin family they're pretty easy because it's pretty much the same except for the notes. I know you're like, oh my gosh, I have to learn these individually, but the thing is with this, the more you look at it and read over it, the more you'll see the relationships among some of these. You're kind of like, oh, well, all of these here, these 3 are bacteriostatic. I mean, you start grouping them more naturally the more you look at this. And for me, it helps me remember, oh yeah, that's the one like at the top of the page on the second page. And I don't know, I'm more visual that way, but whatever floats your boat while studying, this is going to be one of those things that you will need to practice over and over again. This isn't one of those things that you, like if your test is on a Monday, you don't want to learn this the weekend before. This definitely I mean, you can maybe learn it over a weekend, but you're gonna have to keep practicing it for probably like a week to just know it backwards and forwards. It, I mean, I don't know. Just some people leave this to the last second or like the last minute while studying, and they, I don't know, they're kind of up a creek with no paddle because this takes longer than you expect, and you're like, oh, I know the whole thing, and then you sleep on it, like you fall asleep, and then you wake up, and then you're like, I'm gonna review it, and then you realize that some of the stuff didn't stick that you were hoping was gonna stick. So, anyway, whenever you're studying this handout, okay, here are the antibiotics. Mechanism is basically how that antibiotic affects the cell. The mechanism, you want to think how that antibiotic affects the cell, and then then antimicrobial action. So the action takes on the cell, so it'll either be bactericidal or bacteriostatic. Bactericidal, suffix "cidal" means to kill. So, like this, like for instance, penicillin, that will kill the bacteria. If it says bacteriostatic, if you think of static, that's kind of like stagnant, where there's nothing really going on. Like the bacteria doesn't die, but it doesn't really grow. So it's kind of there. In a way, you can kind of think of it as like deactivating the bacteria, if that helps. But I just think of bacteriostatic like this, and then bactericidal is like this because it's killing the bacteria. The bacteriostatic, there's not really, it's just limiting. There's no growth, there's no death, that kind of thing. The spectrum / organisms, basically the spectrum is what kind of organisms the antibiotic acts on. So penicillins will only affect gram-positive cells. Aminoglycosides affect gram-positives. That includes Pseudomonas. They are not effective against anaerobes, streptococci, or enterococci. What's the type of enterococci? Yeah. Okay. So that's how you read that. And then inhibition is basically how those antibiotics are inhibited or prevented from being able to do its action, or basically like it blocks the antibiotic from doing its job, or inhibits the antibiotic from doing its job. The notes, I think, are the most helpful in helping you remember the individual antibiotics, because it's a distinguishing characteristic for them. And some of this, like for instance, PO means oral, first line. Tuberculosis treatment, RX is treatment. Hepatotoxic, hepato means liver, so toxic for the liver. Nephro, kidney. NDD, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. So this is one of the things you just need to practice from rote memorization. And grouping does help with antibiotics, but the grouping, it's kind of hard to just group them right off the bat whenever you're learning this. So I tried to memorize like 2 or 3 a day, but every day that I would learn 2 or 3 more, I would still review the ones I had learned the prior days or the previous days. So anyway, that's what I recommend. Whiteboard, study sheet, talking it out to yourself, and then maybe studying with a group. This is definitely a good handout to quiz each other on. There's a lot of questions you can ask, and you can ask grouping questions, you can ask specific questions, but you definitely need to spend some time studying by yourself for this handout. Okay. Now I'm going to go over some basic definitions, and then I'll talk about sensitivity determinations for this. So, I'm sure you hear antimicrobial and antibiotics, that kind of thing. So if You hear antimicrobial. Just think antimicrobial means agents that inhibit or kill microorganisms. Okay, because anti means against, and then microbial, you think microbes, so against microbes. Antibiotics are chemicals. Oh, I was about to say chemically. My bad. Okay, chemicals naturally produced by bacteria or mold that inhibit or kill other microbes. So there are features of antibiotics, and those features are selective toxicity, spectrum of activity. So from the handout, like it says spectrum/organisms. So basically, like this, when everything is spectrum, you kind of think of like the color spectrum, for instance. So how wide or how narrow of organisms do those antibiotics affect in action? Okay, so I'm going to talk more about these features now. Features, yes. Selective toxicity. Selective toxicity kills or inhibits. That does not look great. Okay, inhibits microbe without harming host. It's usually against a microbial agent, not in host. And then you have the therapeutic index. And therapeutic index is the highest amount of drug. Whenever, yes, the therapeutic index is the highest amount of drug that can be tolerated by the patient. So it's the lowest toxic dose. So basically, the higher the index, the less toxic the dose. And then whenever I said action, that's just referring to bactericidal versus bacteriostatic, and I already explained that. And then the spectrum of activity. That can be broad, narrow, or intermediate. So as you can see here, the spectrum, it doesn't really necessarily say, oh, I mean, yes, broad spectrum here, but I meant there's not really anywhere that says intermediate or narrow. But I mean, if it's narrow spectrum, it's kind of obvious because it specifically names the bacteria. You know what I mean? So Basically, if it's a narrow spectrum drug, the drugs can act on few pathogens. If it's a broad spectrum drug, like these three, sulfonamides, trimethoprim, fluoroquinolones, if it's broad spectrum, that means the drugs can act on many pathogens. So next I'm going to talk about pharmacodynamics, specifically sensitivity determinations. So pharmacodynamics, it basically means how do antibiotics interact with bacteria to neutralize them. And it depends, pharmacodynamics depends on the effect of concentration. Yep. And then what falls under sensitivity determinations, basically MICs and MBCs. You can maybe put the Curry-Bauer diffusion test, that's kind of in its own category. So MIC stands for minimum inhibitory concentration. And minimum inhibitory concentration, it's kind of in the name, but it basically means the lowest concentration of drug that prevents growth, of organism in vitro. So this is I. So MIC is minimum inhibitory concentration, the lowest concentration of drug that prevents growth of an organism in vitro. And I have a picture for that. So if you look at organism A, the brown indicates the growth. So basically, MIC, minimum inhibitory concentration, the lowest concentration of drug that prevents growth. So the lowest concentration that prevents growth. That would be here for 0.12, because technically, right, you're basically gonna, you choose the tube that shows no growth to the naked eye, but it's it's the closest one to growth. So the MIC for organism A is 0.12 micrograms per mil, organism B is 1 microgram per mil, and organism C is 16 micrograms per mil for MIC. But MBC is a little different. I will first tell you what MBC is first before explaining that picture. So MBC is minimum bactericidal concentration, and MBC is the lowest concentration that kills 99.9% of bacteria. Okay, so let's say that we take organism, well, let's see, 16, yeah. So let's say we took organism C, And there were a few other tubes not shown here that had like 8 micrograms per mil, and we had 16 micrograms per mil. See, the thing is, to the naked eye, it may not show growth, but to form a colony, that takes a million cells, right? In order to see it, in order for the naked eye to see it. So there can still be growth that may not be visible to the naked eye. So you would take what you think, what's the MIC, and then a couple tubes before that, and then you plate it and see if any colonies grow. So it may appear clear to the naked eye, but once you plate it, you'll be able to truly see if there's any growth or not. So in this case, the MBC would be the 16 micrograms per mil, not the 8 micrograms per mil. Because MBC is the lowest concentration that kills 99.9% of bacteria. So the lowest concentration that kills 99.9% of bacteria is not 8 because there's growth, there are bacterial colonies. So that lowest concentration is 16 and not 25. So 16 micrograms per mil would be the MBC here. And also, this is a side note that you can add for sensitivity determinations. If you're looking at ratios, when the MBC over the MIC, when that ratio is less than or equal to 4, the drug is bactericidal. When MBC over MIC, the same ratio, is greater than 4, the drug is bacteriostatic. The activity depends on the bacteria, the therapeutic index, and the growth phase of the bacteria. I said this last bit because bactericidal and bacteriostatic are the two kinds of actions. So the bactericidal or bacteriostatic depends on the bacteria itself, therapeutic index, and the growth phase of the bacteria. So next, I'm going to talk about the Kirby-Bauer disc diffusion test. It's also called the Kirby-Bauer antibiotic susceptibility test as well, aka Kirby-Bauer antibiotic susceptibility test. Okay, so basically what happens is you put organisms on plate, okay, and the agar can be Mueller-Hinton. I'm not really sure what other agar works with this, but basically you put like organisms on this, and then you apply the antibiotic, and there are rings that form. Basically, there can be large rings, there can be small rings, there can be no rings really, and these rings. So this area around here, that part of the ring, is a zone, and that's called the zone of inhibition. So zone of inhibition, there's a relationship. So the larger that ring is around the organism, the more that measures the susceptibility of that organism to that antibiotic. So zone of inhibition correlates to susceptibility. of organism. So you can think of the larger the zone of inhibition, the more susceptible that organism is. More susceptible. Or the smaller the zone of inhibition, the more resistant that organism is. So that zone of inhibition measures susceptibility, but when there's really a small zone or no ring or no zone of inhibition at all, that indicates resistance. So whenever you do the Curry-Bauer disc diffusion test, you would measure the diameter of these rings, and there's a chart that goes along with the therapeutic index, I believe, and that can help you classify whether or not that organism is resistant, whether that organism is resistant, intermediate, or susceptible. Okay, so the picture I'm going to show y'all is here. These are the rings I was talking about. So this is the zone of inhibition right here, that kind of donut looking thing. And so this would be considered susceptible, susceptible, because it's a large zone of inhibition. And then these, you would probably just need to measure the diameter in millimeters and compare it to the chart. But those could be intermediate, but definitely these are resistant here. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about resistance mechanisms. Resistant mechanisms. So basically the rings here, the lack of rings, you're probably thinking, how is that organism resistant to that antibiotic? Well, they can do a few things. So one way would be to decrease the drug uptake. And by doing that, the organism is altering membrane permeability. So altering like transport proteins, etc. Then there's also another mechanism of resistance is drug inactivating enzymes. Drug inactivating enzymes. Example, penicillinase. So you can guess that's an enzyme that inactivates or deactivates penicillin. Another mechanism of resistance is to modify the target molecule. And then there's increased export via heat flux pumps. Okay, so also I just wanted to add, with decreased drug uptake, you can also do, an example of this would be porrin proteins, which you see in gram-negative cells. Porrin proteins prevent entry into the cell. Increased elimination, you can think increased elimination. That's another way you can describe the increased export. Basically, the drug enters but the efflux pump ejects it, and with drug inactivating enzymes, the enzyme modifies the drug, which inactivates it or deactivates it. And then modifying the target molecule, the drug cannot bind to the target molecule. So those are resistance mechanisms. For efflux pumps, okay, y'all have that down. Just to add on to the efflux pumps. If y'all remember from exam 1 material, we talked about ABC transporters and NFS, ABC ATP binding cassette proteins, and MFS major facilitator superfamily. Well, there's a third kind for efflux pumps, and it's called R&D transporters. And R&D stands for resistance modulation division proteins, or transporter proteins. Transporters, modulation division, transporters. R&D transporters are chromosomally encoded. It's a 3-part pump, and it's involved with bacterial response to oxidative and nitrosative stress. So usually that's about, you don't really need to go in as much depth. You just knowing the 3 kinds of efflux pumps, and maybe knowing about the 3-part pump, of how R&D is a 3-part pump, and just basically what I just wrote here. The next part is acquisition of resistance, and that is done through spontaneous generation or the acquisition of new genes. Spontaneous mutation or the acquisition of new genes. So for spontaneous mutation, that occurs at a frequency of approximately 10 to the 9, so like 1 in 1 billion. It's done through, spontaneous mutation would be done through vertical evolution, affects progeny, which makes sense because vertical gene transfer is like mother to daughter, so and the daughter is considered the offspring, and progeny means offspring. Okay. Acquisition of new genes is basically referring to gene transfer. So horizontal evolution. So there can be antibiotic resistance through spontaneous mutation or gene transfer. So vertical evolution or horizontal evolution. So examples of this, there'll probably be more during lecture, but I'll put a few here. Clostridium difficile. Vertical evolution. basically Clostridium difficile acquired its resistance from or through vertical evolution. So that would be part of spontaneous mutation. VRE stands for vancomycin resistance enterococci. Vancomycin resistant enterococci. Done. It required its resistance from horizontal evolution. Then there's Bursa, vancomycin resistant Staphylococcus aureus, and then there's Strep pneumoniae. I mean, there's a few more, but those are just a couple. And speaking of vancomycin is on your handout. Yay! So vancomycin affects the alanine. Alanine is an amino acid chain in growing cells. Bactericidal, MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, and Clostridium difficile. That's what vancomycin affects. It is inhibited it does not cross the outer membrane of gram-negative cells. Given IV intravenous, drug of last resort except for MRSA and AAC. And AAC is the antibiotic-associated colitis, which is caused by Clostridium difficile. So next, what I'm going to talk about are the attack points of antimicrobials. Attack points of antimicrobials. So the goal of attacking these certain, I'll draw a picture of the attack points like on the cell, but the goal is to attack bacteria but not affect the host. So this is the goal of antibiotics, like where those antibiotics are affecting the cell. They want to kill that bacteria on the host, but they don't want to affect the host. So this is where selective toxicity comes into play. So if you're looking at a cell, drawing nucleic acids basically, and then these are polypeptide chains I'm drawing, so proteins. And I'm just drawing the cell membrane, or like I drew the cell membrane basically, and the cell wall is what I just drew. So cell wall synthesis. So cell wall, remember, is peptidoglycan. So the antibiotics that attack at these particular points, I'll finish writing up the attack points first, and then I'll list out the antibiotics. And then protein synthesis. Metabolic pathways, like folate synthesis, basically. And then cell membrane integrity. Okay, so the antibiotics that attack these specific points on, like the antibiotics that attack these particular points on the cells or the bacteria are the following, and that's what I'm fixing to write. So beta-lactam drugs. It's like beta-lactam drugs would be here. You can think of like the penicillin family if that makes it easier for you. And then vancomycin, and bacitracin. Yeah. Nucleic acid synthesis, fluoroquinolones, and rifamycin. Protein synthesis, aminoglycosides, tetracycline, macrolides, chloramphenicol, nicotinamide, oxazolinones, and metabolic pathways, sulfonamides, and trimethoprim. And then cell membrane integrity, polymyxin B. Yeah. So pretty much these antibiotics affect or attack that particular part of the bacteria. Okay. And then the just as a side note, if you want to write this, the beta-lactam drugs, because like I said, those inhibit cell wall synthesis. So beta-lactam drugs, they inhibit cell wall synthesis they interfere with the formation of the peptide side chains between adjacent strands of peptidoglycan by inhibiting penicillin binding proteins, PBPs, penicillin binding proteins. So the antibiotics that contribute to the inhibition of cell wall synthesis, I have a couple more to add. So penicillin, basically that's the beta-lactam drugs. Cephalosporins, vancomycin, bacitracin, and daptomycin. So I said what the beta-lactam drugs do in relative to the inhibition of cell wall synthesis, and then vancomycin binds to the amino acid side chain of NAM, N-acetylmuramic acid molecules interfering with peptidoglycan synthesis. And then bacitracin interferes with the transport of peptidoglycan precursors across the cytoplasmic membrane. So that's those individual roles there. And then pretty much the antibiotics that you need to know that and that are involved with the inhibition of processes on the ribosome. I know I listed the ones that had to do with protein synthesis, but these are like I'll write them out and then I'll say like how they inhibit the processes on the ribosome. So aminoglycosides, and just so you know, on the antibiotic handout, if it has some of these subcategories and like underneath aminoglycosides, for instance, please know those, like clindamycin, you know that, not just lincosamides. Same thing with macrolides, you know erythromycin and azithromycin, so make sure you know those. Okay. Aminoglycosides, tetracyclines, streptogramins, macrolides, chloramphenicol, lincosamides, lincosamide, yes, and oxazolidinones, yes. So aminoglycosides, tetracyclines, and aminoglycosides and tetracyclines interact with the 16S rRNA and the 30S ribosomal subunit, and then all these interact with the 50S subunit. So aminoglycosides block the initiation of translation and cause the misreading of mRNA. Tetracyclines block the attachment of tRNA to the ribosome. Streptogramins interfere with a distinct step of protein synthesis. Macrolides prevent the continuation of protein synthesis. Chloramphenicol prevents the peptide bonds from being formed, or there's that peptidyl transferase reaction that facilitates that peptide bond forming. Well, chloramphenicol prevents that peptide bond from forming there. And then lincosamides prevents the continuation of protein synthesis, and oxazolidinone is thought to interfere with the initiation of protein synthesis. That's the name, by the way. And that's pretty much it for this. Honestly, the key is this handout. If you know this handout, then that really covers the majority of this information that I talked about in this video, excluding the first bit, though, of the video with like Kirby Bauer and the other sensitivity determinations like MBCs and MICs. So, again, this is one of those things. It's like with this exam 3 material, it's about how you study, and a lot of this is rote memorization. Rote, like you're thinking, I don't know if you've heard of rote memorization, but basically it's just repetition. So writing it out, talking it out, reading it, I mean, you just need to dedicate time to studying this every day. This isn't one of those things that you want to cram over the weekend. Like, you definitely need at least a week's head start with studying all this material, especially if you want to understand it well, too. So that's pretty much it. And if you have any other questions about understanding some of this, you can always ask your SI or your professor. It's just, with some of this material, it depends on how much in depth your professor wants to go. Because this is kind of more of a general overview. It's not quite as in depth in microbiology 24-21. If you take med micro, though, it will be more in depth and you'll have more antibiotics to learn. So good luck studying, and I hope you all have a good rest of the day. Bye.